Today is Friday, February 11th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. I often discuss questions pertaining to the natural sciences, to moral philosophy, to history studies, and so on, and I make it clear that I feel a responsibility to defend and maintain the traditional teaching of the Catholic Church and of Aristotelean philosophy, especially in matters of natural philosophy and moral philosophy. I often face ridicule for the positions that I defend, and I'm treated as if the position that I take and the responses that I seek are unreasonable. Some imagine that I make the arguments that I make just for the sake of argument, that I just do it for the exercise of arguing. But that's not true. These are my real persuasions. These are my real convictions and beliefs as a 47-year-old Catholic man. I was a pre-medical student in college. I worked in a laboratory as a college student. I know what the sciences teach. I know what the universities teach. I was a Dean's List student as a pre-med student. I was in the biology classes and the chemistry classes and the physics classes. I was in the labs. I know what the teachers teach. I know what the textbooks say. I'm not talking about subjects that I am ignorant of. I became a classicist after I chose to abandon plans for medical school to devote myself to Christian education. My questions are sincere. There's a passage in the book of Acts that my conversations often remind me of. In Acts chapter 26, St. Paul is speaking to a man named Festus who works in the Roman government. And St. Paul was a well-educated man as a Jew. He received an elite Jewish education, and based on the time when he lived and the subjects that he has knowledge in, he was a student who received a classical liberal arts education. He was a learned man in the ancient world, not only in classical studies, but also in the study of the Jewish scriptures and the Jewish religion. He was a very well-educated man. He explains this himself when he speaks of his life before his conversion and the Jewish tradition in which he was raised, but he was also a Roman citizen and, as I said, an educated man. And after his conversion, all of a sudden, there is an extraordinary transformation in his beliefs and convictions. And he begins speaking of things like the resurrection of the dead. This man Festus, in Acts chapter 26, verse 25, laughs at St. Paul when he listens to his Christian teaching, and he says to St. Paul, "Your learning has driven you mad. Your learning has made you crazy. You've studied so much that you no longer are in touch with reality. your learning has driven you mad. And the character in literature that represents this spirit of one who is driven mad by learning would be Don Quixote. If you've never read the story of Don Quixote, many are familiar with scenes from the story of Don Quixote, but I recommend that you look at a copy of Don Quixote, but focus on the opening chapter, the opening pages, where it explains what caused Don Quixote to become crazy, and you'll see its philosophical studies. And St. Paul is accused of going mad because of his great learning. And St. Paul responds to Festus and says, "I am not mad. I speak words of sober truth." And I've always loved that response from St. Paul. He's accused of having been driven mad by his Christian learning. And his response is sober itself, and he says, "No, I'm not mad. This isn't a joke. I speak words of sober truth." And I believe that the positions I hold on what are admittedly controversial subjects, the ideas that I defend and share publicly, I believe that these are words of sober truth. I'm not making these statements or arguments just for the sake of being contentious. These are my true convictions. These are my true beliefs. I believe in the Catholic faith, in traditional Catholic teachings. I believe in things that were taught and approved by the Catholic Church throughout history. And I confess that there are ideas that were taught by the Catholic Church in past generations that are now commonly denied. I also am an adherent to the school of Aristotelean philosophy. I know that many people say that. Many people will say they're Thomists or that they're Aristotelians. But as soon as we begin to discuss Aristotelian philosophy, they deny many of the most fundamental teachings of Aristotle's philosophy. Well, I don't. The other problem is that the ideas that I speak of are often caricatured, and things that I actually say are not responded to, and things that others say of my views are not my views at all. They're misrepresentations. I study the writings of Aristotle. I don't care what other men say about Aristotle. I don't care what other men say about topics that Aristotle may have discussed and taught on. I'm speaking from the writings of Aristotle, and I study them quite diligently and have done so for a long time. And I feel that defending these ideas is a matter of conscience. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about what some of these ideas are. I'd like to distinguish them from caricatures of them, and I'd like to explain why I spend so much time writing and talking about them and why I take them seriously. I'm going to start with a topic that I've discussed quite a bit recently, and that's Aristotle's natural philosophy. Now, if you go online and you search a topic like Aristotle's model of the universe, or the Ptolemaic, it's spelled Ptol, Ptolemaic model of the universe, you'll see a model of the universe that has the earth at the center of that model. Now, of course, I know that this is referred to as geocentrism or the geocentric model, and then you've got all kinds of people talking about geocentrism. I have nothing to do with anyone else. I don't care what anyone else says, what anyone else has written or talks about. I have nothing to do with what anyone else calls geocentrism. I'm an Aristotelian. So just because the Aristotelian model has the earth at the center does not mean that anything anyone says in the name of geocentrism is necessarily what I believe or think. And so any response to geocentric speakers or writers has nothing to do with me, and I don't care what anyone else writes or says. I care what Aristotle teaches. I'm an Aristotelian. And so Aristotle begins his investigation of the natural world with a demonstrative method of investigation that he himself discovered and established and taught in his organon. And the word organon means the method or the instrument by which all philosophical subjects are to be investigated. This method of investigation is what we call the art of reasoning. Once we accept the art of reasoning as true, then when Aristotle begins to put that art to work on different subjects, we're going to see that Aristotle provides demonstrative arguments for the things that he teaches. He begins with what is known. He begins with what are called universals, general truths that apply to entire classes of things. And by the art of reason, he simply applies what is true of a class to the individual members of that class. That's what reasoning does. And so when Aristotle investigates a question in natural philosophy, that's his method. He begins with universals, and based on what's known of particular things, he makes judgments related to those universal statements. So there's the art of reasoning, and there is the observation of the natural world. After all, we're talking about things that are visible, tangible, material, and so on. So these are observable things. This isn't a discussion of metaphysics or of logic itself. This is a discussion of natural physical bodies. And so Aristotle is employing his method of reasoning with observation. Now, in the 1600s, the Aristotelian method was abandoned and rejected by a revolution that's called the scientific revolution. The ideas of the scientific revolution were articulated in a book written by Francis Bacon titled The New Organon. Remember, Aristotle's work on logic was called the organon, which means the instrument or method. And Francis Bacon proposed a new organon. Francis Bacon argued that everything that was taught in human history was influenced by superstition, religious beliefs, myths and legends, prejudices, And the teaching of the ancients was more concerned with self-enrichment or private benefits than with the truth. And Francis Bacon taught that we need to break with basically everything that is known about the natural world and start from scratch. And we need to use a different method to build a completely new knowledge of the natural world based entirely on what we refer to as the scientific method. In doing this, two great systems of learning were rejected and abandoned. One was the Aristotelean philosophy based on the old organon, and the other was the authoritative teaching of the Catholic Church, the authority of sacred scripture and sacred tradition. Whatever sacred scripture and sacred tradition said about the natural world was rejected as part of this ancient delusion or superstition, and was to be replaced by the results of experimentation, the use of our senses to observe and investigate the natural world, and as Francis Bacon argued, also the development and use of instruments or tools that would allow us to basically magnify all of our senses and allow us to see, hear, smell, touch, and taste much greater and much smaller things than we can observe by our senses, our naked senses, as it were, or our natural senses. And so we have this instrumental experimentation developed, and Francis Bacon is referred to as the father of the scientific method. Now remember, I was a pre-med student. I took all the science classes. I did well. I have no problem with modern math or science. I understand the modern maths and sciences. I respect the scientific method for what it is. There's obviously no problem with anyone saying, hey, if you'd like to know what's under the ground, you can get a shovel and dig a hole and look. If you want to know what's inside a cave, you can go into the cave. If you want to know what's under the ocean or what's in the ocean, you can get in a submarine and drive through the ocean. Obviously, no one has any objection to something so obvious and simple. That's not the question. There are two things that I'd like to emphasize, and this is why I hold these doctrines and traditions as strongly as I do. Aristotle was one of the most gifted intellectuals who ever lived. He was a student of another of the most gifted intellectuals who ever lived, who himself was a student of one of the most famous and gifted intellectuals who ever lived. We had Aristotle taught by Plato and Plato taught by Socrates. Aristotle and these men who lived in ancient Greece weren't just isolated thinkers who sat in an office or in a corner of a room and thought about what might be outside. These men were highly influential men who had connections throughout not only their own society, but other nations as well. These men had access to astronomers, other philosophers, other cultures and their philosophical traditions and observations. These men ran leading schools of philosophy in the ancient world. Aristotle, for example, was employed by King Philip of Macedon to tutor Alexander the Great as a child. Philip of Macedon was the most powerful man in the Mediterranean at that time, and Aristotle was his son's tutor. That's the level of influence and connection that these men had. These were not isolated men living in a corner, thinking about what might be outside. These were men who had connections at the highest levels of society and access to all the learning in the world that was available. So when Aristotle teaches something, when he makes a statement, it's highly unlikely that he's going to make a statement that is easily proven false by simple observation. The ancients were not stupid. The ancients were capable of describing the universe. They knew about the planets and stars, the sun and the moon. These things were known by the ancients. And they may have known them much better than most of us know them because they were so much more focused on them because they lived in ancient societies. For example, when you want to tell the time, you look at a watch. If you want to know the date, you may look at a calendar. Well, there were no calendars then. They were the ones who developed the calendars. The heavens was the calendar. The sun was the clock. And by their greater dependence on a knowledge of things like the hours of sunlight of the day and the seasons and the movements and phases of the moon and constellation and its relation to the calendar and so on, they were much more conscious of these things than we are today. So when someone like Aristotle, who stands at the head of a great philosophical tradition that was filled with wise and diligent men, we can't allow ourselves to imagine that he would ever say something for which there was no evidence or which could be easily proven false. He lived in an environment where these men in these schools of philosophy held each other accountable and argued constantly. Read any of his works, and you'll see how carefully and diligently he examines the teachings of other men and accepts what's good and refutes what's bad. And he provides all of his reasons for the refutations. Anything that he refuses, he explains why he refuses it. These aren't just lazy, prejudiced, superstitious guesses at what might be true. These are very carefully investigated subjects, and the teachings are the results of years and years of study, investigation, collaboration, discussion, argument, teaching, and so on. These aren't careless shots from the hip from some guy. This is a leading philosopher of his generation who happens to be one of the leading thinkers in all of world history. So anytime the teaching of Aristotle is irreverently and easily dismissed by some modern teacher or scientist or just anyone, we can see that they don't understand who or what Aristotle was, and they don't give respect to the teaching as being very carefully investigated and articulated. Now, I have no problem with someone saying that they think Aristotle was wrong about something. I don't believe that the writings of Aristotle are divinely inspired or infallible or any such thing. But I do believe that they're authoritative philosophically. And I can easily explain why. For example, St. Thomas Aquinas held and taught the philosophy of Aristotle. That's pretty strong. That's a pretty strong reference for a philosopher to have, that someone as brilliant and diligent as St. Thomas Aquinas found no fault with the teaching of Aristotle, but embraced it and taught it himself. It's not just me and Aristotle. It's Aristotle followed by 1900 years of acceptance and established tradition following his teaching. And I see myself as standing in that line of men who embrace and follow the teaching of Aristotle. But nevertheless, if someone says, I don't believe that Aristotle is right on this or that topic, that's fine. The authority, the established authority of Aristotle has to be respected, though. And proof needs to be given to justify disagreeing with Aristotle. The proof that would be necessary, at least for me, would be demonstrative proof that what Aristotle teaches is impossible. One would have to prove that what Aristotle teaches is impossible. In order to get me to abandon a tradition, a philosophical heritage that I love very much, it would need to be shown me that what Aristotle teaches is impossible based on available evidence, reproducible evidence. And if someone provided me with such evidence, I would acknowledge that on that point, Aristotle appears to be wrong, with no problem. Because I have no spiritual obligation to agree with Aristotle. I do so because I believe that what he teaches is true. However, what happens is someone comes along who disagrees with something that Aristotle teaches, and they don't provide any demonstrative evidence that what Aristotle taught is impossible. They simply create a new theory or make a new argument that is plausible or that is possible. For example, the heliocentric theory that the sun is in fact at the center of the universe is plausible. And we can look at the models that were created by Copernicus and other modern astronomers, and we can see that they have put together a model, and they can show that their model is possible. The fact, however, that their model is possible is not proof that Aristotle's model is impossible. In fact, they're both possible. And if they're both possible, then we should simply acknowledge that they're both possible. Aristotle's model agrees with the evidence, and Copernicus's model agrees with the evidence. They're two different models, two different ways of looking at the universe. And this is in fact what Einstein explained in his book on the evolution of physics. It's simple to understand that if you stand on the earth and look up to the heavens, what you see is different from what you see if you were to theoretically stand on the sun and look at the universe. There'd be two different frames of reference, what Einstein referred to as two different coordinate systems. We can understand that. That's not complicated. That's not hard to understand. And if someone would admit that they simply prefer to look at the universe from the perspective of the sun rather than the earth, I'd have no problem with that. But they would not have proved that my Aristotelean view of the world is false. They would simply have proven that another model is possible, and there's no conflict there. The problem arises when the scientist or astronomer who embraces this Copernican model goes beyond that and says that the possibility of the Copernican model proves that the Aristotelian model is false. That's not true. And that's my objection. My objection is not to the Copernican model being possible. My objection is to anyone who goes beyond that and suggests that because a sun-centered model can be developed and presented that is plausible, that the Aristotelian model is therefore impossible and false. That's what I object to. When people start talking about what Aristotle says and what Aristotle thought and what Aristotle taught or wrote about and so on, I often wonder, in a modern education, in the modern system of education, from kindergarten through 12th grade and into college and university studies, at what point do any of these modern scientists actually study the writings of Aristotle? Where does any modern scientist or astronomer first prove himself to understand and know the teaching of Aristotle from the writings of Aristotle before he begins talking about what Aristotle says and thinks and teaches and so on? Like I said, I was a pre-med student. I know what the course of studies look like from where I was at my point in studies as an undergraduate pre-med student to where medical studies conclude. I have relatives who are doctors, and I know all about the education that they've received. At no point in their education did they ever study Aristotle's writings. So where does this knowledge of what Aristotle thought even come from? It's largely caricatured and imaginary, and much of what's said is simply parroted. It's simply copy and pasted or repeated from things that are said by others. And there's no actual knowledge of what Aristotle taught. And the teaching of Aristotle is oversimplified and misrepresented all the time. And that's where I usually step in and defend the teaching of Aristotle. When I do so, I'm treated like I'm crazy, like St. Paul standing before Festus. I'm accused of being crazy because of my philosophical studies, because I actually study the writings of Aristotle. When I talk about Aristotle, I'm crazy. But the people who talk about Aristotle having never studied his writings are the ones who are learned and careful and evidence-based in their conclusions. You can see how ridiculous that is. What I ask those who make such claims, who state that Aristotle's teaching is false, I ask them to show me the evidence where it's demonstrated scientifically that Aristotle is in fact impossible. Again, if you're a high school student studying biology and chemistry and physics, you never have access to the actual studies and experiments and results. You're simply told what to believe, and you're taught that somewhere someone proved it. But you never see any such evidence. You never see any such demonstration. You're not presented with all the options, shown all of the available evidence, and then told to choose what you think is the best option. The students are explicitly taught in the schools that this is true and known and proven, and this is crazy and superstitious and ignorant, and so on. It's so ridiculous that one would think that Aristotle never thought to look outside before he spoke of the natural world. The arguments are so ridiculous. Children are told what to believe by those who claim to believe in the teaching of modern science, although they don't have any evidence or ability to justify why they teach what they teach, other than it's what's required for their job, for their paycheck. And so we can go to a higher level and we can say, okay, well, beyond high school, when you get to college, you take a biology course, chemistry course, physics. I took astronomy and cosmology at Rutgers University. At what point was I ever provided with access to the actual evidence for the things that were taught in my quote-unquote science textbooks? I was never shown the evidence that prove this or that is true. I was told that scientists believe this and know this, we know that, and I'm left to assume that somewhere someone has actually proven this. What I'm really asked to do is simply trust scientists, whoever they may be, wherever they may be, and believe that the things in my biology textbook, in my physics textbook, in my chemistry textbook, in the other textbooks of other courses, all of which are influenced by this scientific approach to learning, I'm told to trust and to believe, to study and memorize and repeat what the textbooks say. And this is done in the name of the scientific method. The teachings of men like Copernicus is oversimplified and misrepresented, as is the teaching of Aristotle, so that the teaching of the modern scientists appears to be obvious and unquestionable, and the teaching of Aristotle appears to be ridiculous. How could anyone ever believe this or that? And like I said, Aristotle is made to be some kind of inexperienced, cloistered, crazy person who just imagines what life must be like outside of his cell, rather than a leading intellectual who is employed by kings at the peak of Greek civilization. Now, what I ask those who disagree with me for is I ask them, where can I find this evidence? I'm interested in learning. I'm interested in seeing that Aristotle has been proven false. I'm interested in seeing a demonstration that proves not that a heliocentric model is just one possible frame of reference, but that the sun actually, demonstrably stands at the center, and the earth actually, demonstrably moves around the earth. If I can be shown that this is true, not by an image that's drawn or a diagram or some cool, slick, modern animation that's been created, that's what I see presented as the evidence. If you can understand this diagram, then you can understand the heliocentric theory. Watch this video. If you understand this animation, you can understand, well, that's not demonstration. That's just an animation. That's just a diagram. Most of the diagrams don't even represent the actual teaching regarding heliocentric theory. The diagrams are meant for little children. They don't demonstrate anything. They just illustrate or help someone to see what the modern scientist is saying. But it doesn't prove that what the modern scientist is saying is actually true. It certainly doesn't prove that what Aristotle said is false. And when I ask, where is this evidence? Where is this actual data or demonstration that proves, or that did prove at some point in history, that the things that Aristotle taught are actually demonstrably impossible? I don't know where anyone would find that information. I don't know where any high school or university science teacher would have access to that information. And when I ask, again, I'm treated like St. Paul and told that my classical studies are driving me mad. But the people who claim to represent scientific investigation based on reproducible experimentation mock someone who asks them for evidence. I see this as a fundamental failure of their whole method of investigation. The scientific method is about reproducible demonstration through experimentation. And again, I have no problem with a theory. If someone would like to propose a theory that contradicts Aristotle, that's perfectly fine. But the purpose of proposing theories is that the theory is then tested by experimentation. The theory doesn't become an assumed premise that's then used to draw conclusions that appeal back to the theory for their proof. The theory is what's in question. The theory is proposed, and then science is supposed to show us whether the theory is true or false. But what I find is that the theory is proposed and then assumed to be true. It's assumed to be true until proven false, almost like the principle of justice. It's presumed innocent until proven guilty. And again, that's fine as long as we say so. I have no problem with someone saying, I'm going to assume that this theory is true and see where it leads me, because that's how Socratic reasoning worked. We propose an answer to a question, and we see what the consequences of that answer are down the road. So I have no problem with proposing a theory and then assuming that theory is true, but we have to admit that that's what we're doing. That's dialectical reasoning. That's not the scientific method necessarily. And so what I see in modern science is that a theory is assumed, but then the scientists seem to forget that that was just a theory that is being granted for the sake of an argument. the theory slowly begins to turn into an assumed reality. And it's appealed to not as something that's being investigated, but it's appealed to as something that is actually already demonstrated. And that's not true. The author of the theory is then appealed to as an authority, as if no one would have any right to question a theory proposed by Copernicus or Newton or Einstein. And what happens is this science becomes more and more like a counterfeit religion that replaces scholasticism, that replaces Roman Catholicism. We trust in the authority of the fathers of scientific history. We trust in theories, not as theories to be tested by experimentation, but we trust in them and hold them as if they were articles of faith that can't be questioned. And as I said, when I ask, where is the evidence that demonstrates this to be true, I'm laughed at as if what I'm asking for is crazy, as if what I'm saying makes no sense. But that's the whole point of the scientific method. And so at the end of the discussion, when I say, I do not believe, or I am not aware of any evidence that proves what you're saying, and I don't care that it was said by Copernicus or Newton or Einstein or anyone else. I'm looking for scientific demonstration. I'm not looking for another religion. I already have a religion to begin with. But what we see is that science does in fact become a counterfeit religion. Now, I don't understand why many Catholics have given in to this kind of modern reasoning in the natural sciences. I don't understand, and I'd like to give an example. On my desk, I have a copy of a Douay-Rheims Bible, a Catholic Bible that was published in 1899. It was published with an imprimatur by the Archbishop of the Archdiocese of Baltimore. And in my Catholic Bible, if I turn to the book of Genesis and I look at the first chapter of Genesis, I read, "In the beginning, God created heaven and earth." And there's a footnote. And in my Catholic Bible, if I look down to the footnote, I see that a date is written. And so I read, "In the beginning, God created heaven and earth." And I look down to the footnote and it says, this took place in 4004 BC. In this Douay-Rheims Bible, published with permission from the church, published in 1899 by a Catholic publisher, I'm told in the footnote of my Catholic Bible that the world was created in 4004 BC. And I say to myself, well, if I was living in 1899, that was obviously what the Catholic Church was allowing Catholic people to believe, that the world was created in 4004 BC. That's 6,000 years ago. And there are other sources that teach the same thing. The Bible itself, when read literally and assumed to be historical and reliable historically, will lead us to that same conclusion. In fact, that's where that number comes from. It comes from a traditional reading of sacred scripture, and it was held to be true as recently as 1899. Now, if I turn around today in modern society, I see scientists, historians, theologians talking about the earth being billions of years old. I see history teachers talking about painting in caves that are 15,000 years old. I hear scientists and archaeologists talking about digging up fossils that are hundreds of thousands of years old. And I hear this not from some kind of crowd of unbelievers, but I'll hear Catholics saying the same things. In fact, if I look in a modern Catholic Bible, I don't have one in front of me right now, but if I were to look in the footnotes of, let's say, the New American Bible, I'll find statements about dates and events that contradict the statements in the footnotes of my 19th century Catholic Bible. And what I'd like to know is what evidence proves that this date of 4004 BC is false. I'm not asking if the modern scientific community believes that the world was created 6,000 years ago. I don't care what other people believe or don't believe. These men claim to be scientists, and what I'm asking is, where is the demonstrable evidence that proves for us that the statement that the world was created in 4004 BC is impossible in light of the evidence? Where is that evidence? Who has that evidence? If a priest accepts this modern theory that the world is millions of years old, at what point was evidence presented to him that allowed him to assert that this statement in my Douay-Rheims Catholic Bible is actually false? At what point did he have access to that evidence? Where is that evidence? How did he come to that conclusion? Or is he just parroting what the scientists tell him is to be said? I don't understand where anyone is accessing this evidence that proves the world was not created in 4004 BC. Again, I'm not objecting to someone proposing a theory that the world is much older and seeing where that theory takes us. That's the point of scientific investigation. There's no problem with that. But when you do that, you have to admit that that's what you're actually doing. You're proposing a theory and then working to test whether or not that theory is true based on experimentation, not by simply stringing together more and more theories and building what appears to be a plausible explanation for a different story, and then using that story composed of theories to turn around and say that what this Bible says is actually false. That step there is what I object to. I don't object to the scientific method. I don't object to proposing theories that contradict what has been said in the past. The only thing I object to is that last leap of faith where a person goes from saying, this is a theory that I'd like to investigate, to your belief is false. It's that leap that I object to. And like I said, if Christians have embraced these ideas, let's say that the sun is at the center of the universe, and that Aristotle and the worldview that was accepted and taught by every saint who lived in the history of the church, that they were all positively and actually wrong in their teaching, and that this heliocentric theory is actually not a theory, but demonstrable fact of the natural world. I'd like to see that evidence. I'd like to know where Christian people have actually seen this evidence. Again, not a diagram, not an animation, not an explanation of why this is possible, but a demonstration that the old teaching was in fact false. Where is that demonstration? Now, I said earlier that for me, this is a matter of conscience. I believe that the church embraced Aristotelean philosophy because it was true, and it was judged to be in harmony with the divine revelation that was preserved by the Catholic Church. When I look back in history and see men like St. Augustine, St. Albert the Great, St. Thomas Aquinas, on, embracing Aristotelian philosophy and teaching it, I believe that these men, who were holy men, filled with the Holy Spirit, are right unless they're proven wrong. And I have no interest in separating myself from the saints and doctors and fathers of the church unless someone demonstrates to me that what they believed and taught is in fact impossible. I'd also refuse to assert that the statement that the world was created in 4000 BC is false, and begin walking around saying things like this happened in 10,000 BC and this happened in 2 million BC and the world is 4 billion years old. I don't know how anyone justifies making that assertion as if it's demonstrable fact that they've been convinced of by looking at the evidence and seeing those statements demonstrated to be true, rather than a theory that they simply grant and believe in like an article of faith. How does this scientific teaching that's in the mouths of millions of people, including Christians, how does this scientific teaching differ from the articles of faith in the Catholic Church? How does it differ? Faith, we're told, is the evidence of things unseen. I have never seen a burning bush. I wasn't there. I don't have video evidence that Moses saw a burning bush. But I read the scriptures, and for many different reasons, but most of all by grace, I believe that the account of Moses seeing the burning bush is true. I believe that, and I have no problem saying that. I have no evidence except for the testimony of the scriptures themselves. I have no direct observation. I've never run an experiment where I demonstrated that a bush can burn and not be consumed. No scientific evidence. I believe that. I believe that Jesus rose from the dead. I was not there to witness it. There is no video evidence. I have no physical evidence of my own or observation of my own that Jesus rose from the dead. I believe that Jesus rose from the dead. And I have no problem admitting that it's an article of faith that I believe. And when someone tells me no, there is no resurrection, I have no evidence, and I'm not interested in believing that doctrine. If someone tells me the world did not or was not created 6,000 years ago, but actually evolved over a period of billions and billions of years, I don't believe that. And I don't have any reason to say that that is actually scientific fact. As far as I know, it's simply an article of faith that's being presented to people to either accept or reject. None of these people have evidence of these things, so I don't understand why they assert them as if they do have evidence. So when you put all of these things together, these day-by-day arguments and discussions, I know what Aristotle teaches, and I know that it's plausible. I know what modern science teaches, and I agree that it's plausible, theoretically possible. But the minute we move from that to science proves Aristotle is false, I simply have no reason to grant that that's true. I don't see evidence that proves that's true. The people I talk to never show me evidence that led them to say that. I see it simply as an alternative to Aristotelean philosophy, and seeing that Aristotelean philosophy was embraced by the Catholic Church in scholastic theology, it's an alternative to scholastic theology, and I have no interest in accepting a system that contradicts scholastic philosophy. I'm not interested in this other religion. If I read in my Bible that the earth was created in 4000 BC, I accept that by faith. And if you present me a different theory, I'm interested in seeing the evidence, but I have no reason to believe that the earth is billions of years old. I mean, just think about it. Even if you listen to an evolutionist, there's no evidence of human writing or recorded history before this date of 4000 BC. Is that just a coincidence? Modern scientists who propose and talk about these incomprehensible dates and numbers of years and millions of years, they refer to that period as prehistory. Why do they do so? Why is it called prehistory? Because there's no evidence that it's true. It's based on theories upon theories upon theories. It's a religion. It's an alternative to scholastic philosophy. It's an alternative to Aristotelian philosophy, and I'm not interested in it. I already have a philosophy. I already have a religion. I'm not interested in this science religion, and there are reasons why I'm not interested. First of all, I owe my happiness in life to Christianity. I didn't find Christianity. Christianity found me and changed my life and made me happy. I am certainly committed to Christianity, and I see it as completely responsible for the happiness of my life. I'm not interested in another religion or philosophy unless I can be assured that I'll be more happy than I am now. And I certainly don't see modern science making people more happy than Christianity can. Secondly, Aristotelean philosophy doesn't just give me a model of the universe based on my own personal observation, or I should say, not based on, but I should say that can be confirmed by my own observation. Modern science doesn't present me with a system that I can confirm with my own resources, and therefore I find it less convincing. Thirdly, Aristotelianism not only provides me with a system of natural philosophy that is perfectly reasonable and in agreement with what I observe in the world, but the same instrument, the same art of reasoning that provides me with my natural philosophy also provides me with a system of moral philosophy that is very helpful in my life. In fact, the system of moral philosophy that Aristotle taught is usually embraced by people who, for no explicable reason, reject his natural philosophy, which is based on the same principles. And so if I'm going to reject Aristotelian natural philosophy, then I would also lose my Aristotelian moral philosophy because it's based on the same principles, same arguments, same instrument. And if I were to embrace this scientific, modern view of the world, what would my moral philosophy be? What does science offer me as a system of moral philosophy? It offers total confusion. And so when I make a list of pros and cons between Aristotelian or scholastic philosophy and the philosophy presented to me by modern science, there's no contest. What I have is better. Why would I grant the articles of faith being presented to me by modern science when modern science offers me a system of thought that's inferior to the one I already have? And so I just find no justification at all for Christians who embrace this modern scientific view of the world. I don't know where they ever saw any evidence that would justify the things that come out of their mouths, that they pretend to be convinced of. Where's the evidence? I just don't believe that they're actually convinced of those things. I believe that they agree to say them for other reasons. I agree to confess the articles of faith because I want to gain eternal life. I'm willing to admit that. I believe that most people who confess the articles of this modern scientific faith do so because they want the rewards that this modern scientific community offers them, which comes in the form of jobs and degrees and other temporal rewards. I believe that that's why they are willing to confess these things and pretend that they believe them to be true. I don't believe that they have any actual evidence that leads them to confess that they're true. And that's why I'm an Aristotelean. And the same is true for my Catholic faith. The reason why I believe what I believe about the scriptures and about the way of salvation and about the church is because I look back at a history of saints and wise men who, to be honest, I trust. I know that these men sought the truth. I can read their writings and see how diligently they worked to discover the truth, and I trust them because of the effort that they made to know what was true, the reasons they give for why they believe what they believe, the lives that they famously lived. I trust the saints. I would never contradict one of them unless I was absolutely certain that on that point they were wrong. And I have no evidence to lead me to believe that they're wrong in most points that I read in their teaching and writing. And certainly that's true of Catholicism itself. The Catechism of the Catholic Church provides a summary of everything the Church teaches, thousands of paragraphs of official teaching. I challenge anyone to read that book, go paragraph by paragraph, and show me which paragraph is false, and show me the evidence by which you can prove that that paragraph is in fact false, and not simply that you don't agree with it, or that you're not willing to confess it to be true. I believe it's true, and I don't believe that there's any evidence that can possibly prove that it's false. Now, what I believe this comes down to is faith, but also authority. And I'd like to give a little illustration that explains how I look at authority. Let's say that I'm a father and I have a child. I have authority over that child. I provide for that child. I pay for that child's cost of living. And consequently, I have the right to tell that child what to do, especially when he's handling things that I'm the owner of. I have authority to tell this child what to do. Because I provide for this child, I'm legally responsible for this child. So imagine I tell my son, you may not eat candy without my permission. You may not eat candy without my permission. And I say to my son, because if you eat candy, candy can cause your teeth to decay and you can get cavities and it can cause all kinds of problems. And I'd like you to avoid that. So you're not allowed to eat candy unless you ask me and I give you permission. That's my rule. And my son hears that and understands that that's his father's rule. And let's say my son walks down the driveway to my parents' house, because my parents are our next door neighbors. And my son is met by my mother, his grandmother, who has a pocket full of candy. And she says, oh, hey, here's some candy. Would you like to have some candy? And my son says, actually, Daddy told me that I'm not allowed to eat candy unless I ask his permission first. And imagine that made my mother upset, and she asked, why did your father say that? What's wrong with having some candy? And then my son said, well, Daddy said that candy can cause my teeth to decay and I could get cavities and have problems, and that I shouldn't eat candy unless I have his permission. And let's say that my mother didn't agree that it was true that candy causes cavities or can lead to problems. And so she told my son, oh, that's not true. A little bit of candy isn't going to cause any trouble. It's okay. Go ahead and take a piece of candy. Grandma said so. Well, now my son is faced with a dilemma. He has a command from his father, whom he has a responsibility to obey because of authority. From his father, he has not only a command, but also a reason for a command. That reason is objected to by his grandmother, who has no authority to tell him what to do or to tell him to disobey his father. What should my son think about? Should he think about the reason that was given and the objection that was raised? Or should he think about the command from his father? The answer is he should think about the command from his father and not lean upon his own understanding or trust in his own ability to judge what the truth is, especially when Grandma didn't prove that what his father said is actually false and impossible. So the objection doesn't change anything, and the boy will simply choose one thing. He will choose to submit to the authority and obey his father, or he will choose to disobey his father. All of the other talk about the reason really has nothing to do with it. That's the role that authority plays in our lives. We don't know the answers to most of the questions and dilemmas we face. What we think about things is often possible or probable, but not certain. There are very few subjects about which we have any kind of experiential, scientific certainty. And therefore, authority is a much more reliable guide in our lives than our own understanding. And that's why the Proverbs tell us. You can read this in Proverbs chapter 3. It tells us, do not lean on your own understanding, but trust in the Lord. That is, trust in the authority of God and obey his commands, even when they don't appear to you to be necessary. Don't lean on your own understanding. That's what Scripture tells us, but rather submit to authority. When I look at the teaching of Aristotle, I look at Aristotle as an authority because of the testimony of history, because of the testimony of the wisdom and virtue of the men who have followed and borne witness to the value of his teachings. I look at him as an authority in matters of philosophy, and I can read the arguments and the proofs that led him to his conclusions. And I look at the church as an authority. If the church tells me to do something, it's like my father telling me to do something. And because of that authority, obedience is a safe guide to my life. And the only way that I could ever justify disobeying is if it could be demonstrated to me that what I understood the command to be could not possibly be true and was actually a command that caused me to sin against God and against my neighbor. The only way that I can justify disobeying the church, or a doctor of the church, or a catechism of the church, or an article of faith, the only way that I could contradict what I see as an authority would be by a complete and perfect demonstration of the impossibility of the command or of my knowledge and understanding of the command. And that's why I don't think having an alternative that's simply possible justifies abandoning Aristotelian philosophy or Catholic moral teaching or Catholic theology in general. And that's why in 2022, I'm an Aristotelian and a very comfortable and happy Roman Catholic.